Configure the vSphere storage appliance. So, so this topic kind of makes me chuckle a little bit. I don't know. To me, the vSphere storage appliance is a perfect example of be careful what you ask for. And I think you'll find as we start to kind of play around with this storage appliance that you'll see, I think very quickly, why it exists. You'll see what was asked for. You'll see what was delivered. And then you might see why it might be difficult to justify why you might want one of these things. I don't know. You be the judge. But I want to spend this nugget talking about the vSphere storage appliance, what it is, what it's designed to do, how it may help you, and what you're going to have to pay in order to get to it. In this nugget, we'll spend time with the architecture, the use cases, the host resources that you'll have to have, and then how to really work with the thing. So really, what was the idea here? As you can imagine, so very large environments have lots of hardware, probably have a SAN already in place, some sort of storage area network. And so pulling in and moving the virtualization, very easy thing to do. Right? You put a bunch of servers in place, some of them you probably already have, and you hook them up to your SAN, you carve out a piece of the SAN, and poof, you're vMotioning. Whee! Well, if you're not that large environment, right, you're a smaller environment, you don't have a SAN. Maybe you don't got servers either. Right? And so you want to move to virtualization. You want to enjoy all the nice benefits that everybody else has, but you're saying, hey, why don't you make an instance of this thing that is just as highly available as a SAN, but is factored for my budget? And so here comes the vSphere storage appliance. Now, the vSphere storage appliance is effectively a 2 or 3 server configuration, and in fact, you can put it in either the 2-host configuration or the 3-host configuration. Now, different from a storage area network is the fact that each of the hosts in this configuration has its own disk, its own local disk. You can see here I've got my 2 hosts and the 2 hosts, and each one's got its own independent local disk. And in the 3-host configuration there on the left, each one has its own local disk as well. So VMware said, all right, we will create this mechanism by which you can have not a single instance of a SAN, but instead replication between the items here. So if I have 2 different hosts in a 2-host configuration, I'm going to have a data store here and kind of a shadow data store over here. Right? And if I have a 3-host configuration, I will have 3 data stores and 3 shadow data stores. And if I ever lose one of the hosts, well, then the shadow data store will take over immediately, just as if an original data store was there. This is great. So, wow, I don't have to buy a SAN. I can have local disk here, right? Local disk isn't that expensive. $250, $300 for, you know, a reasonable 300 gig size local disk these days. Plug a couple of them in the server, punch 3 of them in there on a RAID 5, and poof, you're off to the races, right? Well, things start to get a little interesting when you start figuring out all the different requirements that one has to have in order to support this. So the assumption here is that this is, at least RAID 5, probably RAID, at least RAID something, okay? RAID 0 for striping, 1 for parity. 5 for parity with, or 0 for striping, 1 for mirroring, and 5 for striping with parity. So I've got RAID 5, so I'm already losing some percentage of it there. In case of 3, it's going to be a third of that. Well, then now I also have to have 2 copies of the data everywhere. So I'm losing a third for RAID 5, and I'm losing another half because I have to duplicate the data. So I'm only really getting about a sixth of my data here, right? Or well, whatever that ends up, however the math ends up adding up. The net result is that if you really want local disk for your storage area network, well, you're going to have to pay some interesting taxes in order to get there. This is the from VMware's vSphere 5 Documentation Center, the vSphere Storage Appliance Planning Checklist. And I want you to pay particular attention here, because if you're thinking about this thing, well, you're going to have to architect this appropriately. So you should decide on the scale and capacity of VSA cluster and consider some limitations here. So when you create a VSA cluster, your hosts cannot be running any virtual machines. And this is partially due to the installation. The installation is designed to be kind of brain dead. In other words, you just run it and it goes. vCenter server must be installed and running before you create the VSA cluster. Now, as you can imagine, because there can't be any virtual machines, your vCenter server can't be on a virtual machine, which even VMware likes to have their vCenter servers and virtual machines these days. If you run vCenter server on a VSA data store and the data store goes offline, you might not be able to manage the VSA cluster. Okay? So they're kind of saying that if you're going to do this, you can't do it you really can't do this with vCenter being a virtual machine. More here. If you decide on a 2 or 3 member VSA cluster, note that you can't switch. So you can't go from 3 to, obviously you can't go from 3 to 2, but you can't even go from 2 to 3 after you set the whole thing up. So you're fairly limited there in terms of capacity. You need to determine the capacity of the cluster before installation, because it does not support the addition of storage to the data stores and their replicas after the cluster is created. So you are going to define how much storage you need, and then you can't change that after you create the whole data store. The cluster requires RAID 10 virtual disks, so 1 plus 0, and then the storage appliance uses mirroring to maintain the replicas, so the capacity of the data stores is going to be only 25% of your total physical hard disk capacity. I said RAID 5 a while ago, I meant to say RAID 10. So if you set up, you put 300 gig hard drives in there, you're only going to get 25% of that 900 gigs total that you can apply to your virtual machines, which is not that much. Okay, so here's some more interesting things. You got to be conscious about emission control reservations. If you have a 2-host cluster, you're only going to be able to put virtual machines on effectively 50% of the total resources, because emission control takes control. If it's a 3-host cluster, you've got to burn 33% for your waste. There's only 2 of the hosts. You can't do VMX swapping. So if I start this nugget chuckling a bit, it is because this is a great example of you get what you pay for as it relates to some of these requirements. Again, VSA is designed for these small environments. You're a small environment, you want to go to virtualization, you want complete availability with HA and all the fun things that the people with SANs have. But when you really start poking into it, some of the costs really start getting up there as you start figuring out all the pieces that you need. So let's say that you've decided you want this thing. Okay, I have created ESX 4, 5, and 6 here, and in a different data center, because you can't do this with, it's really difficult to do this with existing ESX hosts. They cannot be in a cluster. They have to have the original network configuration, no changes to that original network configuration. This is designed to be kind of green fields when it comes to the installation. Okay, it's really not designed to layer over the top of anything that you already have. You can do it, but it involves a lot of kind of, there's some extra effort involved if you do want to do it. Now, there is one other caveat to this too, and that is if you're running just like I am here inside of VMware Workstation, these 3 hosts, they're required to have the abilities to be part of an EVC-enabled cluster. And nested virtual machines don't work with VMware EVC. So there's one little hack here I want to show you, that if you want to test this up, if you want to mock this up in your own environment, kind of play around with it a bit, you're going to want to implement this little hack. And you go to Program Files, VMware, Infrastructure, Tomcat, Web Apps, VSA, Web Apps, VSA Manager, WebInf, classes, very, very deep as you can tell, and then dev.properties. And if I open this with WordPad, what I want you to do is take a look at one of these early lines in here where it says evc.config. This will say equals true whenever you first download this installation. So you're going to download this off of VMware's website. Once you download it off of VMware's website, the first thing that you will do is you will go and you will open it up and install it. This install.exe file will attempt to install some stuff, and then it will fail. And you will have whatever is necessary in here that I am just showing you, and then you will make this adjustment so evc.config equals false. Okay, that tells it, yeah, don't worry about the EVC thing. Okay, so that's step one. Step two then is to go into your services console here. And once you're in your services console, there are two services that you're going to have to restart in order. The first is the VMware, where did it go? VMware VSA cluster service. So restart that, then restart the virtual center server. Okay, so download the VSA, attempt to install it, make that change, then restart these two services. That gets you the first step here. Okay, so once you're done, however, you've got this VSA attached to your drive somewhere. You kind of want to go through this process twice because the first step in the process actually adds in this little tab right here called VSA Manager. Okay, and the VSA Manager, you've got to add this piece in order to get the exposure for all the stuff that I showed you for the hack. Once the VSA Manager is installed, that brings up the VSA Installer Wizard. Now, I've kind of humorously told you all of these requirements and how the VSA intends for this to be kind of a green field or brand new, fresh installation of everything. And part of that's designed because this is intended for really, really, really introductory individuals who have no experience with virtualization, who want to essentially bring three servers together and click one button and watch the whole thing just do all the work for them. Completely understandable. If you don't want to, go through all the learning processes, well, this is an understandable thing. So you can create a new installation here, and it does all the work for you. Let me go through this step here. I'm going to show you how the installation works. You'll notice that when we install this, we create this storage appliance cluster, and we enable it for vMotion and HA. If I hit next again, here's my VSA data center. I'll reload the data center list just to make sure. And the three hosts that make up this VSA data center. Again, remember, if you're going to do this, you have two options, the two-host and the three-host configuration, and once you make that decision, you cannot unmake that decision. Now at this point, we've done that hack, so even though it says here that these hosts have an unsupported EVC configuration, and in fact, if you look at the details here, it'll tell you a bit more about how you're not well configured for it, you can actually select these three hosts at this time, and it'll let you click the next button, so this is okay. Now, the next piece of this is the network piece, and this is a part that this may sort of itch you a little bit funny because it definitely itched me a bit funny. The VSA does not support installing itself into a network that starts with 192.168. So if you're like a lot of businesses and you start out with a small environment and it's easy to do yourself the usual class 3 net address of 192.168. Whatever, well, you're out of luck because a 192.168 net address will not function. It's got a hard-coded limitation in there, so it won't do it. I have actually, for these three hosts, put them in a 10-net address, 10.1.1.1, or 10.1.1. And I've also had to, sort of in the background, reconfigure vc.company.pri so it exists on that net. Another problem here is that this other server that hosts your vCenter environment, that can't be a virtual machine, that has to be somewhere else, has to be in the same subnet. So if you're a 192.168 address net shop, you're going to have to create another address, something outside of that protected network, in order to support this VSA thing. So there you have it. There's what you need to know. Create yourself a 10.1.1 net address, just like I did, or something else equivalent, and work from there. I'm going to give now this VSA cluster address 10.1.1.100. So once you've got all these hosts in here, these three hosts are now connected up to this vCenter server. At this point in the creation of your VSA cluster, you need to give it an address. And there are going to be actually somewhere between about 11 and 14 different addresses that are automatically created whenever you plug in that first address. And it does so sequentially. So if I give it 10.1.1.100, for the next three servers, it's going to give it 101, 102, 103, 104, and 105, 106 for its management and data store IP addresses. So this is just by default. And you can change these, obviously, but this is by default. The back-end IP address is also may need to get changed as well. You see here 192.168.0.1. I think the idea here is that this back-end network is this private address, this 192.168 net address for the back-end pieces. So take a look through here, make sure all these addresses are correct and that you don't conflict with any of them, that your gateway is correct, your subnet mask is correct. And if you intend on, for the vSphere feature, if you intend on using DHCP for the virtual machines and whatnot that are being used there, you can do that, or you can hard code those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that should function for this step in the process. Now the next step here is you have to choose whether or not you want to format the disks on first access or format them immediately. I don't want to have you have to go through all the process of waiting to fill those with zeros, so I'll click the next button and format them on first access. We've been going through this list here on the left-hand side, but here are all the settings that we've configured, and hopefully, if we've done everything right, we can click the install button and begin the installation. So this last error box here essentially says, be aware, we are going to delete and essentially rebuild this environment from scratch. So I'm going to click the yes button here and begin that installation. Then I'm going to pause it so that it can go through all of the things that it needs to. And when we come back, we'll have a completed installation that you can actually take a look at and see what a VSA looks like. So here we go. And poof, we're back. All right, so the VSA is now created. I will admit, actually, that I had to create it twice because I punched in 100 instead of 10 for my IP address, so I actually had to go through it twice and redo it. Again, just highlights the fact that you have to be very conscious of what the IP addresses are that you're going to be using for this entire infrastructure. Another important point here, too, is the fact that when you provision your virtual machines, make sure you provision what is essentially a single volume. Right? And that volume, remember, because you can't change the capacity that you've assigned to a VSA once you've created it. I created these as essentially 40 gig servers, and so the capacity is 7 gigs. And because this is a 3-node server, the total capacity is 7 gigs. So I can support the loss of a host, but I don't really have a lot of capacity here because I didn't create one giant volume for where the ESX operating system exists, and then also where all the storage is. There are 3 data stores here, 7 gigs apiece. I have 3 appliances also, 0, 1, and 2, that correspond to those 3 hosts. Okay, so all of this is, here, you can see here within the HA cluster. I even have a very nice map, easily one of the most symmetrical maps that's out there for how all these things are interconnected. A couple other important points here is that the VSA has a couple of options here within the screen to enter cluster maintenance mode, meaning you would make adjustments to the cluster itself, or if you need to reconfigure the network. Now, interestingly enough, if you do either of these, doing so requires turning off all the virtual machines across the entire cluster. If you try to go into reconfigure network mode, you're going to essentially make the entire cluster unavailable. So you are getting HA here, but you're sort of not at the same time, because to make any of these large-scale changes requires essentially an outage. When you do create those virtual machines, okay, and you go up here and right-click and choose to create a new virtual machine, be aware that there are some other interesting limitations here as well. Not the least of which is the fact that a VSA cluster does not support the use of memory over commitment. You simply cannot assign more memory than is available, or you can't assign more memory than is available. Right? So if I have 5 virtual machines, each of which has 16 gigs of RAM, well, I have to have 5 times 16 gigs of RAM in that in the summation of the hosts to be able to support that. And the way that you would go about that is by actually setting a memory reservation on a virtual machine to reserve all of the guest memory. I'm not going to go through the process of creating a virtual machine so I can show you, but when you're creating those virtual machines, be aware that in the resource allocation panel, you're going to want to set the checkbox to reserve all guest memory so that you don't end up overcommitting your memory. The VSA does not like that whenever you do that. So this is really how you'll operate with that VSA. When you've got it, the next step is to create virtual machines, and you've already seen that, so there's nothing left to see here. But this is the functionality that the VSA provides, and also just some of the cautions associated with those sorts of limitations in this 1.0 release of the appliance that could come back and bite you depending on what you want out of your vSphere environment. So what we talked about in this nugget, we've talked about how you would go about configuring the vSphere storage appliance. I did mention in the first part of this nugget that the architecture for this VSA almost makes me chuckle just a little bit because you really do get what you ask for. And I spent some time helping you understand what the architecture of the VSA, both in its 2-server and 3-server architecture configuration, also the use case for when you might deploy it. If you don't have a storage area network and you're not looking to get one anytime soon, the VSA can be potentially a good thing for you. Talked about how you can appropriate host resources and also the client resources too. Be aware of that memory overcommit problem and make sure also that you configure the hosts so that they have essentially one big large volume with which to be able to cut out the necessary bits the VSA will use and then make highly available. We talked about then how to configure the ESXi hosts, configure those storage networks, and then ultimately deploy and configure the VSA manager and work with its storage resources. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.